The stone floor glistened, not with life, but with the residue of suffering. Morning dew had crept in like a thief through the infirmary's crumbling walls, pooling in silent corners where rats dared not tread. The stained glass above fractured saints and angels, filtered the rising sun into broken shafts of color, reds like fresh blood, yellows like old pus, and through this fractured light, a child whimpered. The boy lay on a straw-stuffed cot, lips split and blistered, eyes glassy with fever. His breaths came in shallow bursts, each one like a thread fraying at the edge of a worn tapestry. Beside him, the barber surgeon prepared his tools, stone scraping steel with a slow, deliberate rhythm, an executioner's lullaby. The blade shone for a moment in the half-light, then disappeared into shadow as the surgeon turned. The air reeked of vinegar and bile, of old smoke and burnt cloth. A brazier hissed and popped with damp wood, casting flickering halos that danced across the faces of the dying. Chains of herbs dangled above the door, sage, rue, lavender, dry and crumbling, forgotten protection in a world where death wore no disguise. Outside, the bells tolled, not for celebration, not for birth or union, but for plague. The great pestilence had returned. Its black fingers reached through the alleys and markets, drawing breath from lungs like a lover might steal a kiss, slow, intimate, cruel. Beyond the priory gates, the pesthouse groaned like a beast in agony. Behind its barred windows, souls clawed at the stone for mercy, their moans too familiar to stir pity anymore. And down the cobbled lane, where fog lingered even in the heat of day, came the physicians, draped in robes dipped in pitch. Their beaked masks stared coldly from behind smoked glass. They moved like carrion birds, canes clicking against the stones with mechanical precision, tapping, judging, condemning. No touch of comfort, no word of warmth, only ritual. In a shadowed chamber tucked beneath the priory's chapel, a noble woman lay upon a low bed. She did not cry out as the blood left her arm, pulled by suction into a cup of polished horn. Her skin, pale as wax, glistened with sweat. Her eyes never left the crucifix above the door. In her silence was a plea, not to be healed, but to be forgiven. Her breath trembled, but she did not speak. There was nothing left to say. Medicine, in this age, was not mercy, it was fear, bound in linen and prayer. Fire was as much a tool as forceps, the lancet as sacred as scripture. To bleed was to purge the soul, to rid the body of its sin as much as its sickness. Pain was expected, welcomed even, as if the devil could be exorcised through suffering alone. The poor, of course, had no such luxury. If they could not pay the surgeon or the priest, they were cast to the edge of town. There, leeches did the work of men, and the dying were left to murmur their last confessions to wind and ash. Some were thrown into wagons and carted to mass graves without name or blessing. The earth drank deeply that year. Whispers traveled faster than the plague. They said the midwife burned under a crescent moon, her screams rising with the smoke. She had used willow bark, it was said, to ease the pain of childbirth, and whispered charms too ancient for comfort. Alf. The villagers watched her burn with torches in their hands and terror in their eyes. Not at her magic, but at the illness they could not fight. Faith filled the void where science failed. The townsfolk clutched relics, pressed bread against holy wounds, and dipped crosses in river water. They prayed with cracked lips and bleeding knees, but their gods gave no answers, only silence. And night returned. With it came the coughs, wet, ragged, cruel. Behind every door, a mother whispered to her child, a husband to his wife, promises too hollow to hold weight. Some whispered scripture, others simply rocked and wept. The town dimmed, not just in light, but in spirit. Hope had no place here, only endurance. In the infirmary, the surgeon leaned over the boy. The blade hovered for a moment, then disappeared beneath the ragged edge of a tunic. A cry broke the silence. Thin, high, almost animal, but it faded quickly, and the boy's chest stilled. No one moved. The sun, now higher, caught the blood as it dripped from the cot to the floor. It glistened like morning dew. Somewhere, another bell began to toll, and far beyond the town's edge, beyond the pesthouse, the gallows, the pyres, riders approached, cloaked, silent, and bearing the seal of the crown. They carried, not poultices or prayers, but orders, for isolation, for silence, for control, and so the wheel turned again. The chapter closes, but the sickness lingers, in breath, in blood, in the echo of bells that never stop ringing. A thin mist curled like breath from the open mouth of the forest. The cart creaked through the gloom, its wheels half sunk in the endless slurry of a road long abandoned by mercy. Wolf tracks pressed into the mud, still wet, still fresh, as though the beasts merely watched waiting. Dead leaves clung to the axle like quiet prayers left unanswered. And in the back of that cart, under sackcloth stiff with frost, a man lay dying. Boils bubbled across his throat, blackened like burnt fruit, and dark bruises bloomed across his ribs, silent proof that something terrible had rooted deep within. Beside him, his wife clutched a worn wooden rosary, her fingers raw, skin cracked from both the cold and her devotion. She did not speak. Her lips moved in frantic rhythm, but her voice was already lost, to fear, to despair, to the certainty that God had turned his gaze elsewhere. They were not bound for healing. They were bound for judgment. The Abbey's hospital loomed through the fog, a low sprawl of stone hunched against the hillside, its windows narrow as arrow slits. No bell welcomed them, no kind eyes met theirs, only the groan of iron hinges and the damp breath of mildew and ash. Inside, the walls sweated cold. Torches sputtered along the corridors, their flames too weak to warm, too bright to ignore. They cast long shadows, crosses without saviors, monsters without names. A friar stood waiting. His voice was dry as bone dust, reciting psalms in a tongue the dying man did not understand. Behind him, two novices bore a pot of boiling tard, its surface quivering, like the skin of some angry thing. They passed no judgment in their eyes. Judgment was reserved for God alone. But here, God's will wore human hands. The man was stripped, his sores examined not with tenderness, but scrutiny, as one might inspect rot in meat. A monk dabbed holy water onto his forehead, then whispered into his ear not words of comfort, but instruction. Confess, for here, affliction was not just flesh, it was sin made visible. The soul was the true battleground, and sickness, its price. Those who entered this infirmary did so not as patients, but as penitents. One man, younger than most, knelt beside a bed of straw, his cheeks sunken, his lips trembling. His crime, desiring a woman not his wife, or perhaps merely being seen wanting. The friars called it unholy lust. His treatment was starvation. He had not eaten in 6 days. On the 7th, his fever broke, or perhaps it was the body itself, surrendering to guilt. In another cell, a boy no older than 15 was being purged, over and over, bent double, vomiting into a basin until the bile turned to blood. He wept not from pain, but because he had confessed to doubting the sanctity of a relic. A splinter of wood, claimed to be from Christ's cross, had done nothing to save his sister. His tongue had dared say so. Now his penance spilled out in waves, yellow, red, silent. A physician watched from afar, educated in Salerno, his Latin crisp and cold, his robes clean while his patients bled. He ordered crushed emerald to be added to the boy's next draft. Emerald to draw corruption, viper fat to balance humors. It was said that disease came when bile, phlegm, blood, and black bile lost harmony. But harmony in this place was a myth, like saints with golden eyes. Leeches wriggled in shallow bowls, fattened on the blood of nobles. The poor were given poultices, mixtures of dung, crushed beetle shells, stale bread and old wine. The stench was unbearable, the silence worse. Women fared worst of all. In a narrow room at the edge of the infirmary, a young girl lay barely breathing, her child, dead within the hour of birth. Her own womb would not close. Blood kept pouring, a river that would not cease. The monks called her cursed, they whispered of Eve, of temptation, of punishment passed down through generations. She screamed once, twice, then no more. A novice held a cloth soaked in wine over her mouth, not for pain, but to quiet the blasphemy of suffering. No records were kept, no names carved in stone, only the lesson to bleed was to offend. And yet, outside, the world did not pause. A raven picked at a discarded bandage near the back gate, its wings twitching in the frost. The stain of human fluid gleamed like rust beneath its beak. Life clung on in odd places, in fungi, growing beneath the eaves, in worms that writhed through blood-soaked straw. To live was to suffer was divine, so they said. But deep in the infirmary's crypt, past the torchlight and the incense, a monk knelt alone. He did not pray. He washed his hands, again and again. The water blackened in the basin. His lips moved silently, not Latin, not penance, just pleading, because he had seen too much, and he had begun to doubt. What if sickness was not sin? What if pain was not proof? The questions burned hotter than the tar. The friar overseeing the dying man from the cart stepped forward once more. He carried a small iron tool, glowing faintly red from the coals, a cautery rod. The man was unconscious now. His wife watched from behind the door, her rosary clutched to her chest so tightly that the wooden beads left blood-red imprints on her palm. The friar did not flinch. The rod hissed as it met the skin. A scream echoed, but it was not the man's. It came from deeper in the hall, where another patient, waking from a fevered dream, saw shadows moving in the rafters. They cried out not in pain, but in warning. No one listened. They never did. Outside, the mist began to rise again, thicker this time, as though the forest itself exhaled in grief. And from somewhere beyond the abbey walls, a bell finally rang, but not for healing. It rang for burial. And as the sound faded into the trees, a question hung in the silence like a thread of smoke. What happens when the soul is blamed for what the body cannot bear? The answer would come, in the next breath, in the next scream, in the next trial by fire. In the chill of dawn, a man knelt beside the village well, cupping icy water to his blistered lips. His breath hung in the air like a ghost's whisper. Behind him the church bell rang 3 times, not for mass, nor for mercy, but for the infected. Each toll sounded like a curse. He wiped his mouth, stood, and began the slow walk up the hill, his limbs stiff, his feet dragging through frozen mud. The Lazar house awaited him, a house not of healing, but of forgetting. Beyond the frost-covered hedgerows, the world continued. Smoke curled from cottage chimneys. Chickens clucked, children ran past, but they gave him a wide berth, their eyes wide, their faces hidden behind woolen scarves, as if sickness could leap from skin to soul. He passed beneath an archway, where ivy grew like veins on stone. The door creaked open before he touched it. She stood there, the healer, cloaked in gray, her face weathered, not by age, but by years of watching men rot and boys scream. A wooden cross, smoothed by anxious fingers, dangled from her neck. Her eyes scanned him quickly. Then, wordlessly, she turned and vanished into the shadows of the Lazar house. He followed her into the silence. Inside, time stood still. The floor was layered in straw, soaked with sweat, and worse, the walls were cracked and sweating with damp. Windows were shuttered against the cold, and against the eyes of those who did not wish to see what was inside. Rows of low cots lined the walls. On them lay the forgotten, mouths agape, limbs misshapen, faces eaten away by time and disease. Some had no noses, some had no fingers, some were already half gone. The healer knelt by one, her hands coated in a paste of crushed garlic, resin, and something darker. She whispered to the man, not words of comfort, but something older, deeper, a spell, a prayer, a memory. She worked as if death were watching. She moved from one patient to the next, her footsteps hushed, her touch firm. She burned sage in clay bowls, and hung bundles of rosemary from the beams. she cleansed wounds with vinegar, murmuring a string of syllables that did not match any scripture taught in the churches below. She had been accused once of consorting with spirits, of muttering spells in a dead tongue, of healing the damned when the damned were meant to die. The bishop himself had condemned her, yet he sent his own nephew to her. When the boy's neck swelled like a toad's and blackened at the edges, the boy survived. The bishop never spoke of it again. Here, in this place of exile, she was the last hope, or perhaps the last witness. In the great cities, physicians draped themselves in ermine, strode through halls with golden rings, and treated the nobility with perfumed gloves and polished instruments. They studied the stars and measured bile, cut blood with pride, and spoke of humors with a scholar's tongue. But here, medicine smelled of ash and wine, of open wounds and burnt herbs. Here, it wore rags, it bled, it cried out in the dark. A child whimpered behind a thin wool curtain, pox blotted her skin, and her hands were bound with strips of linen to keep her from tearing herself apart. Her body burned, but she shivered all the same. The healer dipped a rag into cold water, pressed it to the child's brow, and hummed a lullaby that had no name. In the next cot, a boy sat up, blind from fever, calling out, "Mother," over and over. No answer came, only the skittering of rats beneath the floorboards, and the wind pressing against the walls like a dying breath. At night, the healer walked the rows with a bundle of beeswax candles, one for each bed. She lit them not for light, but for the one who comes in darkness, so that death would not arrive uninvited. The flames danced softly, casting shadows like spirits onto the walls. She stood still, watching them flicker, each light a soul, each flicker a heartbeat. She had seen so many go, some fought, some wept, some simply turned away, as if the world no longer interested them. She had buried children with dolls still clutched in their hands. She had whispered blessings over men who died with curses on their lips. She had held the hands of whores and priests, beggars and warriors. In sickness, all were stripped to bone and breath. No names, no titles, just flesh, unraveling. Outside, the world moved on. Markets opened, bells rang, lovers kissed beneath bare trees. But here, the world held its breath. She moved like a shadow between shadows. No one thanked her, no one asked her why. She had long since stopped needing to know. Faith had ceased to be a question. It was now a duty. A weight hung around her neck heavier than any cross. Above the door, a bird had built a nest in the rafters. Each morning, it chirped once before flying out into the cold. She watched it now, her hands still damp with blood and honey. Some days, she wondered what it would be like to follow that bird, to fly above the mist, beyond the fields, past the bells and the whispers and the rot, to vanish. But there was always another wound to clean, another child to soothe, another candle to light, and so she stayed. Outside, snow began to fall, quiet, slow, relentless. Inside, she reached for another salve, and far below in the city, a messenger rode through the slush with news. The plague was spreading again, south this time, toward the river villages, toward the healer's birthplace. She would be needed again, but for now, only the flame spoke, a slow, trembling dance in the dark, and somewhere in the silence, death listened, waiting. The snow fell soft as ash over the castle walls, muffling the cries within. In the queen's chamber, time had folded in on itself. Candles leaned low, their wax pooling like slow tears on the flagstone. The chamber reeked of iron and sweat. Her grip clenched the birthing chair, knuckles blanched white as bone, as though she might hold back death with sheer force of will. Her cries were not wild but restrained, a queen's scream, shaped by dignity and agony. She had once walked these halls robed in velvet and pearls. Now her gown clung to her like wet bandages, stained crimson, her crown long since removed. The midwife, no stranger to blood, whispered prayers between instructions. Ave Maria, gratia, plena. Her hands trembled not from inexperience, but from what she knew lay ahead. The blade in her palm glinted once in candlelight, then disappeared beneath the linen folds. In the corner stood a monk, cloaked in shadow, murmuring rites meant for those who would not return. His breath ghosted in the cold air. He did not speak to the child, only the mother. He knew. A cry rang out, thin, confused, alive. But the queen's body did not answer. Her chest rose once more, then stilled. Down below, oblivion reigned. The great hall rang with laughter. Goblets clinked, grease dripped from roasted goose, staining embroidered cuffs. Minstrels sang. A nobleman recited a bawdy tale, his voice rising just as the queen's heart fell silent. No one noticed the servant girl who slipped away, her apron stained with afterbirth, her hands wrapped tightly around a bundle of blood-soaked cloth. She moved quickly through the snow, not for fear of reprimand, but to fulfill an ancient duty. She knelt beneath the old yew tree, its branches gnarled and watching. There she dug through frozen earth with bare fingers until she reached the roots. She buried the placenta with the care of a priest handling relics. To misplace it would be to doom the child, so the old women said, "Bury it wrong, and the soul wanders untethered." In these stone walls, medicine served not the body, but the bloodline. The noble ill were swaddled in superstition, draped in brocade, while being fed powdered pearl and crushed emerald. Unicorn horn was ground into elixirs, its worth measured not in healing but in status. The apothecary sold hope in glass vials, hope sweetened with honey and ignorance. In the servants' quarters, a child coughed through the night, burning with fever. No pearls, no prayers, only broth boiled from marrow and nettles, and the hope that morning would not find her cold. By the hearth, a knight, one of the king's own, sat with his legs stretched before him, swollen and black-veined. The wound had turned. The healer brought the iron. He bit down on a leather strap, not for silence, for survival. The iron hissed as it met flesh, and the scent rose like a scream. The knight's eyes rolled back, and for a moment, he looked like a child lost in firelight. The tapestry above him bore a hunt scene, boars brought low by steel. Below, a man was burned by that same steel, sacrificed not to war but to rot. Upstairs, the royal physician moved like a shadow through his chamber. Shelves lined with jars watched him, toads dried stiff, bezoars nestled in velvet, bits of mummified flesh powdered fine, artifacts of belief, fragments of long-dead kings, kept not for efficacy, but for ritual. He murmured diagnoses like charms, Latin bleeding from his lips. He had studied in Bologna, where books were chained to the walls and dissections done in candlelight. But even he could not name the sickness that gripped the queen's womb, nor stop it. When the final breath left her lips, the monk stepped forward. His fingers, stained from scripture, closed her eyes. A queen made holy not in life, but in suffering. Outside, the snow had turned to slush, melting where it touched the warm stones of the castle. Steam rose where her blood had spilled, rising like incense into the night. And then, one single toll, a bell, slow, deep, final. It did not ring for the child. It did not ring for joy. It rang for the woman who had died, not in battle, nor by treason, but on a wooden chair beneath a painted ceiling. Her greatest war fought within. Inside the castle, the halls were colder now. A stillness crept through the corridors, unnoticed by the drunk and the dancing. But the hounds felt it. The servants felt it. Somewhere, a tapestry stirred without wind. The newborn was swaddled in silence. A girl, small, blinking, untouched by joy. The midwife traced a cross over her brow, then whispered a name not yet heard by the court. Down in the kitchens, fire crackled. A cook crossed himself, though he didn't know why. A mouse froze mid-scurry, and far away, a candle guttered out in the chapel. It would be days before the nobles acknowledged her passing, weeks before the child was named in public. But within these walls, something sacred had shifted, an ending cloaked in snow, a beginning shrouded in mourning. And so, beneath stone arches and stained glass saints, life went on. But nothing was untouched. The veil had been parted for a moment, and in that moment, medicine had failed, faith had faltered, and a soul had slipped through untouched by cure, sanctified only by pain. The next morning, the snow was gone, the sky above the castle was the color of bone, and in the nursery, the child opened her eyes, unknowing, unblessed, unmothered, and somewhere in the east, drums began to beat, the sound of war creeping toward the cradle. A cockerel crowed in the distance, sharp as a blade across the silence. Morning had come, though it brought no warmth. Inside the healer's hut, time did not move in hours, but in heartbeats and breaths, the ragged, shallow kind. The boy on the pallet whimpered again, a sound so small it might have been mistaken for the wind, but his mother heard it, flinched, and pressed her cracked knuckles to her lips, as though trying to hold back grief with flesh alone. The healer's hands moved with the steadiness of someone who could not afford doubt. She crushed another pinch of dried yarrow, mixing it with the bitter wormwood and rue. Her breath caught at the edge of her chest, shallow, slow, the way it always did when death hovered nearby. Not yet, not this one. She glanced at the mother, and for a moment their eyes met. The woman's gaze wide with terror, the healer's unreadable, like fog curling in the hollows of a forest. The smell in the room was thick, sweat, old herbs, damp straw, and the faint iron sting of blood. Outside, frost traced lace across the windows, but inside, the fire tried to hold the cold at bay. It snapped and spit, smoke curling up to blacken the rafters, where cobwebs trembled with each draft that slid beneath the door. No priest would come here, not after the bishop's edict, not after the trial. She had stood barefoot in the village square, wrists bound, eyes stinging with salt and smoke. Her left hand still bore the scar from the branding, a ring of puckered skin around her wrist, a silent accusation that would follow her to the grave, which, they had whispered. And yet, they came to her still, when the fever came, or the blood wouldn't stop, when childbirth turned to screaming, or something unseen tugged at a child's soul in the night. They came. They always did. The same men who called her cursed would leave eggs on her doorstep and turn their eyes away. Because when the Latin prayers failed, they needed someone who spoke the older tongue. She dipped her fingers into a bowl of cooled ash and drew a mark upon the boy's brow, not a cross, but something older, curved like a crescent and thorn. The boy stirred beneath her hands, his skin blazing, breath thin. She pressed the bitter paste to his chest, where his heart thudded unevenly beneath a cloth that once belonged to his sister. Rowan trees were said to guard the dead. Her grave had been dug beneath one, last winter, when the snows came early, and the priest would not bless the burial. The healer had said her own words then too, quiet ones, honest ones, not meant for heaven, but for memory. The boy's lips were chapped, pale, his limbs trembled again, then went still. For a heartbeat too long, there was only the fire. Then, he coughed, once, then again, harder. His back arched slightly, then fell. His mother gasped, dropping to her knees, pressing her forehead to his, as if she could pour life back into him with her tears. The healer said nothing. She reached for a rag and dipped it in cool water, wiping the boy's face, his temples, the hollow of his throat. She moved slowly, methodically, because she had learned that even relief could be a fragile thing. It must not be rushed, nor named too soon. Outside, the chapel bell rang again. Not for them. It was a wedding, perhaps, or a burial. It didn't matter. The church had its own calendar, and in it, she did not exist. She moved to the hearth, and poured a ladle of hot water over dried thyme and crushed fennel, letting the steam rise into her face. Her bones ached. They always did in winter. Her joints creaked like old wood. But the boy had coughed. He had not gone still. She would not know for sure until nightfall, but the fever had broken. She stared into the fire for a long while, letting her thoughts drift back, past the trials, past the nights of hiding herbs beneath floorboards, past even the times she had knelt herself, a young girl whispering borrowed prayers to saints she did not trust. Her true knowledge had come not from churches or scrolls, but from the dying, from listening, from failures that still woke her in the dark, from watching the plants grow in silence, and knowing which ones healed and which ones killed, and that sometimes, there was only a hair's breadth between the two. A knock at the door startled them all. The mother rose, hastily wiping her face. The healer held up a hand. Wait. Another knock, slower this time. Not the priest. He would not knock. The door creaked open, and an old man stepped through, clutching a cloth-wrapped bundle. Please, he said simply. My wife, she cannot breathe. His eyes did not meet the healer's. He looked at the floor. She said nothing, just nodded, took her satchel. She did not ask for payment. That would come later, in bread, or wool, or silence. Before she stepped out, she looked once more at the boy. The sweat on his forehead had cooled. His breath, though shallow, was steadier now. His mother clutched his hand like it was the only thing tethering her to the earth. The healer passed through the doorway, into the cold. Frost crackled beneath her boots. Smoke spiraled into the pale morning sky. Somewhere beyond the village, crows lifted from a barren tree, scattering into the air like torn cloth. This was her place, not in the light of stained glass, or beneath gilded altars, but in the dark corners, where breath faltered and time stretched, where miracles were made, not by angels, but by stubborn hands and bitter herbs, where she would be cursed if she failed, and forgotten if she did not. But still, she walked. Her figure faded into the fog, a crooked silhouette against the brittle trees, cloak trailing like smoke behind her. And somewhere in the hush of winter morning, the wind carried a whisper, not in Latin, but in something older, something buried, a vow, or a warning. The boy slept. The fire hissed, and the door swung shut. But further down the path, in another home, another scream waited, sharp, desperate, and unanswered. And the healer would answer it. Once it tolled with each passing soul, a solemn cry across the valley, echoing between bare trees and stone walls blackened with rain. But now, the tower stood mute, its rope frayed and forgotten, swaying only with the cold wind. Silence had become its final knell. A rat darted beneath the pest cart. The wheels creaked through the red-brown slurry of blood and mud, slow and steady, as though time itself had taken sick. Limbs jutted from the bundles like broken twigs. Each body was wrapped in rough linen, a cruel swaddling, hands tied at the wrists, as if bound for sacrifice. A child's foot peeked out from one, blue and still, the toe curled like it was holding on to something long gone. The driver did not look down. His breath came shallow through the lavender-soaked cloth, pressed against his cracked lips. His fingertips were black and waxy, as though the rot had already begun. Still, he held the reins, his eyes sunk so deep, they barely blinked. He did not cry, he did not pray. Those things had burned away weeks ago. Windows stared like the dead. Behind warped glass and wax-sealed seams, families waited. Parchment spells, loops of Latin ink written by tired monks, clung to the corners of doorframes, like dried blood. Inside one cottage, the air was thin and sweet with rot. A mother pressed a damp cloth to her baby's head, whispering lullabies through cracked lips. The child moaned softly, too weak to cry. The father sat in the dark beside them, sharpening a blade not for defense, but for mercy. Their eldest son, a boy of 12, had been bled the day before. His screams had echoed into the street, echoing off closed shutters. The bloodletting had done nothing. Now, he lay curled beside the hearth, eyes half open, watching shadows move across the ceiling, like ghosts too tired to haunt. In the corner, the youngest girl still clutched her rag doll, the mouth stitched in black thread, silent like hers. She had not spoken in 2 days. Her silence seemed heavier than death. No candles burned in the house. No prayers rose, only waiting. In the abbey infirmary, death wore a different robe. Sulfur stung the nose. Rosemary burned in brass censers, swung by shivering monks, who recited half-remembered prayers through chattering teeth. Smoke clung to the arches, curling like serpent breath around the pillars of stone. The infirmary floor, once a sanctuary, was now a field of bodies laid beneath coarse wool, faces turned to heaven, with mouths parted, as if asking the sky one final question. A novice knelt beside a dying sister. She was old, her skin like wet parchment, eyes clouded and blinking slowly, blindly. Her hand trembled as it reached for her rosary. The wooden beads clacked against her chest with each shallow breath. "You'll see the Lord soon," the novice whispered, but the nun only coughed, a wet sound that rattled in her chest. A spatter of black phlegm stained her sleeve. Her hand did not release the beads. In the corner, a monk vomited into a pail, the sound raw and human. The censer kept swinging. The prayers did not stop. Outside, smoke curled from pyres that never cooled. Poo-soaked rags, mattresses split open like wounds, and clothes torn from bodies too blistered to bury, all fed the flames. The smoke carried memory with it, thick and oily. The wind took it west, toward the hills, where nothing grew any more but the silence of ash. Not far from the abbey walls, in the cracked upper chamber of an abandoned inn, a scholar bent over parchment. His name once meant something in Paris. He had debated in halls lit by candlelight, and adorned with velvet. Now, his fingers trembled as he scribbled notes on parchment stained with blood. He wrote of swellings in the groin, of fever dreams and blackened tongues. His ink was nearly gone. His faith, even less. He still believed, or tried to, in balance, in the sacred geometry of the four humors, hot, cold, wet, dry. But nothing in his training had prepared him for this. This wasn't imbalance. It was war. War upon the body, upon the spirit. He stared at the corpse beside him. A woman of 30, maybe younger, with dried tears on her cheeks, and a crucifix clutched between rigid hands. Her eyes were open. He could not close them. He could only write. She wept in her last hour. The tongue blackened. The hands turned inward. No blistering. Death arrived before dawn. The candle guttered. He didn't bother lighting another. In the village square, where once children had played, and merchants shouted their wares, only the crows gathered now. They pecked at spilled grain and bones left behind by dogs too starved to care. A few desperate souls still moved, hunched and hollow-eyed, bartering vinegar for herbs, water for a promise. A woman cried for her son, lost 2 nights past. She stood in the square, and screamed his name until her voice cracked. No one came, no one looked. It was dangerous to care. Grief spread faster than the sickness. In a corner by the well, 2 priests argued in whispers. "This is God's punishment," said one, "for pride, for sin." "No," said the other, "it is the devil. The devil walks among us." They both crossed themselves and wept, unsure whether they feared more the wrath of heaven, or the silence of it. Because heaven had gone quiet, and in that quiet, something else had grown. Not hope, not faith, but survival, the kind that does not pray, only endures, the kind that barters with rot, and seals its windows with wax, the kind that watches its neighbors die, and says nothing, the kind that ties corpses in linen, and stacks them like cordwood before the pest cart rolls through. The scholar wrote until the ink faded. The monk swung his censer until the chains broke. The little girl held her stitched mouth doll until her arms went limp. The fire never stopped burning. By night, a fog rolled in, heavy, wet, silent. It softened the sharp outlines of death. The pest cart disappeared into it, one creaking wheel at a time. The driver's silhouette melted into the mist, a ghost already. The abbey bell still did not ring. But in the hills, a candle had been lit. One, just one. Inside a hut, far from the village, a woman stirred a mixture of yarrow and vinegar, whispering to herself. Her child still breathed. She pressed a cloth to his forehead, and waited, not with faith, but with stubborn love. And in that breath, shallow, but steady, a new sound was born. A rhythm, not a cure, not salvation, but defiance. And in the next chapter, that defiance will catch flame, not in the churches, nor the halls of learned men, but in the hands of those who have lost everything, and have nothing left to fear.